The wind outside the archive has shifted tonight. It no longer carries the scent of pine and salt from the northern fjords, but the dry, stinging bite of a frost that has been frozen for nearly 2 centuries. Welcome back to the Midgard Archives, traveler. Take your place by the hearth, pull the furs close, and feel the warmth of the fire as it pushes back the creeping shadows of a world that has forgotten the sun. Step into the light and out of the cold, for tonight we move far beyond the age of iron and sail into the heart of the white-out silence. We are opening a case file that began with the glittering pride of an empire and ended in the absolute, bone-chilling silence of the Arctic wastes. This is the search for the unheard truth of the Franklin expedition and the dark, skeletal remains of the HMS Terror. In May of 1845, Sir John Franklin led 128 men into the labyrinth of the Northwest Passage. These were not mere sailors. They were the elite of the Victorian world, handpicked for their resilience and their standing in the Royal Navy. They were armed with what they believed to be an impenetrable scientific shield. The HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror were not just ships. They were the pinnacle of 19th century engineering. They were outfitted with repurposed railway steam engines that could drive them through the ice and internal heating systems that promised a comfort never before seen in the polar reaches. They carried 3 years of preserved food, libraries of thousands of books, and the absolute certainty that nature could be conquered by the forward march of progress. But as the ships vanished into the fog of Baffin Bay, they entered a landscape of abyssal indifference, a place where the sun refuses to rise for months on end and the ice does not differentiate between the wood of a hull and the bone of a man. To understand what truly happened to the HMS Terror is to confront the internal void of an expedition that did not just fail, but slowly and methodically ate itself from within. The departure was a spectacle of imperial grandiosity. The ships were laden with the luxuries of London, fine china, heavy silver cutlery engraved with the officers' initials, and casks of the best liquor. This was the Victorian sociological shield in its purest form, an attempt to carry the drawing rooms of England into the most hostile environment on earth. They believed that by maintaining the rituals of civilization, the formal dinners, the Sunday services, the reading of classical literature, they could keep the darkness at bay. But the Arctic is a place of revealing horror, and it strips away the layers of a man until only the raw biological truth remains. The first winter spent at Beechey Island in 1845 and 1846 was the first crack in the armor. It was here that the first 3 men died: John Torrington, William Braine, and John Hartnell. For over a century they remained in the permafrost, buried in shallow graves beneath the stones. When they were exhumed in the 1980s, the world witnessed the true power of the white-out silence. The bodies were perfectly preserved, their skin turned to a leathery blue-gray, their eyes still partially open, as if staring at a sky they could no longer see. The sight of John Torrington, a young stoker just 20 years old, looking almost as he did the day he died, was a masterpiece of nocturnal folk horror. It revealed the environmental corruption that had already begun. Scientists found that these men were not just victims of the cold. Their lungs were blackened by the coal dust of the steam engines, and their tissues were saturated with lead. The scientific shield was already failing before the ships had even reached the heart of the passage. By the summer of 1846, the ice did not melt. The abyssal indifference of the Arctic climate trapped the ships off the coast of King William Island. For the next 700 days, the HMS Erebus and the HMS Terror would not move. They became stationary wooden islands in a desert of white. This is where the true horror began to take shape within the hulls. Imagine the sound of the ice pressing against the ship, a constant, groaning, abyssal deep song that vibrates through the wood and into the very teeth of the men. The darkness of the polar night lasted for months, a time when the internal void of the mind begins to expand. The pride of the mission was its food. 8,000 tin cans of meat and soup, soldered shut to preserve the sustenance of an army. However, the search for the unheard truth reveals a catastrophic manufacturing flaw. The tins were sealed with lead solder in a rushed, negligent process. As the men sat trapped in the ice, their primary source of nutrition became a slow-acting poison. Lead poisoning does not just kill the body, it dismantles the mind. It induces paranoia, extreme irritability, neurological breakdown, and a terrifying state of cognitive confusion. Imagine the officers, men who had been friends for years, beginning to look at one another with suspicion, their thoughts clouded by a metallic madness. This was the first stage of the internal void, where the very thing meant to keep them alive became the instrument of their slow, psychological execution. The scurvy followed the lead. Without fresh fruit or meat, the men's bodies began to fall apart. Scurvy is a revealing horror of the flesh. Old wounds from years prior begin to reopen. Gums turn black and swell until they cover the teeth. The connective tissue of the body dissolves. Men who were once the pride of the Navy became staggering, hollow-eyed ghosts, wandering the cramped, dark decks of the Terror, while the temperature outside dropped to 50 degrees below zero. The internal heating systems, so touted by the Admiralty, were no match for the Arctic winter. The walls of the cabins were lined with thick layers of ice, formed by the breath of the sailors. On April 22, 1848, the decision was made to abandon the ships. 105 survivors, led by Captain Francis Crozier and James Fitzjames, stepped out onto the ice. They left behind the safety of the hulls for a death march across King William Island. This is where the curiosa of the expedition becomes truly bizarre and haunting. These men, starving and dying of lead poisoning, did not just carry survival gear. They were seen dragging massive ton-weight sledges across the jagged, broken ice. Search parties later found these sledges abandoned, and what they contained was a testament to the madness of the Victorian mind. Along with the necessary boat and provisions, the sledges were filled with heavy, useless relics, silver spoons, monogrammed plates, scented soap, curtain rods, and even a heavy, brass-bound writing desk. This was a desperate, final attempt to maintain the sociological shield. In their delirious state, they could not conceive of a world where their status as Englishmen did not matter. They were dragging the physical weight of their civilization across a desert of ice that had absolutely no use for silver or soap. It is a terrifying image, men, coughing up blood and shivering with fever, straining against the harness to pull a desk across a landscape that wanted only to consume them. They were literalizing the weight of their own history, refusing to let go of the very things that were ensuring their deaths. As they marched south toward the Great Fish River, the groups began to splinter. This is where the Inuit oral tradition, the manuscript of the air, provides the most chilling and accurate accounts that the British government would ignore for nearly a century and a half. The Inuit spoke of seeing a group of Carblinet, white men wandering the coast. They described these men as having blackened, hollow faces and eyes that seemed to have no light in them. The Inuit tried to offer them meat, but the men were so far gone in their madness that they could not communicate. The Inuit watched from the edges of the white-out silence as the expedition collapsed into a state of total environmental corruption. Most terrifyingly, the Inuit spoke of the figure they called Agluka, the long strider. They described a man who survived long after all the others had perished. This figure, who many believe was Captain Francis Crogger, was seen wandering the coast of King William Island years after the expedition was officially declared lost. He was described as a skeletal man with a long beard, pointing toward the south, a haunting silhouette against the abyssal indifference of the horizon. If this was Crogger, he was a man who had survived the death of his entire crew, wandering the Arctic wastes as the last living representative of Franklin's dream, a ghost who refused to stop walking. The search for the unheard truth eventually led back to the beaches of King William Island, where the bones of the crew were scattered like driftwood. When forensic archaeologists began to examine these remains in the 1980s and 1990s, they discovered a revealing horror that the 19th century sociological shield had tried to bury. Many of the bones showed clear, clinical signs of pot polish. This is a specific texture that occurs when bones are boiled in a metal pot and agitated against the sides during the cooking process. This was the final taboo. The survivors, in their final weeks of life, had been forced to consume their own comrades to stay alive for just a few more hours in the cold. It was not a chaotic act of violence, but a methodical, desperate attempt at survival. The British Admiralty had branded the Inuit as liars when they first reported this, but the manuscript of the bone does not lie. The civilization of the Victorian Navy had ended in a metal pot on a frozen beach. The fate of the ships themselves remained a mystery for over 170 years. The HMS Erebus was found in 2014, but it was the discovery of the HMS Terror in 2016 that truly chilled the blood of the archives. The ship was found in Terror Bay, sitting perfectly upright on the sea floor, 24 meters below the surface. Because of the freezing dark water and the abyssal indifference of the deep, the ship is a time capsule of nocturnal folk horror. Subglacial drones appeared through the windows, and what they saw was a ship that looked as though the crew had simply stepped away for a moment. The glass in the windows is intact. The plates are still stacked in the racks of the mess hall. In the captain's cabin, the drawers of the desk are closed, holding the logs, charts, and letters that have not seen the light since 1848. The ship is not a wreck. It is a tomb holding its breath. There is a terrifying sense of presence in the footage, the feeling that the white-out silence followed the ship down into the depths and is still guarding the secrets of the dead. The archive of the Terror is still sealed, waiting for the day when the scientific shield is strong enough to recover the documents without them turning to dust. As the fire in our archive settles into a cold, blue glow, we are left to wonder about the final moments of the men who stayed with the ship. Why did it sink so far from where it was abandoned? Did a small group of survivors return to the Terror, hoping the ice would finally release it? Did they spend their last days in the dark of the hold listening to the water rise, surrounded by the silver spoons and the books they could no longer read. They remind us that the greatest danger is not the cold without, but the internal void that opens when we realize that all of our technology and all of our pride are nothing in the face of the Earth's abyssal indifference. The story of the HMS Terror is a search for the unheard truth that forces us to look at the fragility of our own sociological shields. We build our world with the certainty of progress, but we are always just one winter away from the darkness. The men of Franklin were not killed by a monster of the ice or a curse of the spirits. They were killed by lead, by hunger, and by the weight of an empire that did not know how to bow to the reality of the North. They are the guardians of the whiteout silence, and their story remains a masterpiece of human tragedy. The archives are closing for tonight, but the search for the unheard truth is far from over. There are more case files to open, more shadows to explore, and more voices waiting to be heard from the depths of history. If the story of the frozen archive has served as your half-fire shield against the frost of the night, please ensure you stay within our circle. Your support keeps the embers burning and the archives open for all who seek the truth in the dark. Subscribe to the Midgard Archives to be the first to hear our next entry, where we move from the frozen poles to the high peaks of the Himalayas to investigate the case file of the 1924 Mallory expedition. The man who sought the roof of the world and found only the sky. Leave your testimony in my comments and share your thoughts. Was the fate of the Terror a tragedy of Victorian hubris, or were the men simply victims of a landscape that was never meant to be conquered by the hand of man? Do you believe Captain Crozier truly survived as the Long Strider, or was that simply a story the ice told to the wind? Stay in the light and out of the cold.